Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Caffe Lena. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for tuning in to this live stream. Whatever platform you're watching on, welcome. It's going to be a fun night. This is our monthly storytelling night. Typically, what happens is there is an open mic as well as one featured storyteller. What we are doing now, the format has changed slightly. So we have 3 featured storytellers, each of whom has been here before as part of our normal storytelling nights. Tonight they're going to have about half an hour each. They might tell one long story. They might tell a series of shorter ones. We have Eliud Nieves here, Marni Gillard, and Fran Yardley. And Fran is going to be up first. She is an Adirondack storyteller. She's been telling stories for many years. She's also an author and has written a book called Finding True North, which she will talk about a little bit more when she's up here. So make sure you check out the tip link, which is how we reward these artists for their work. And that will be on screen and in the chat. And have a lovely evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Reese. Hi, everybody, both here at Caffe Lena and those of you who are tuning in. I want to thank all of you who are tuning in to this evening because it means a lot to us. I want to thank Caffe Lena for making these storytelling evenings happen, and Janine and Christy and Margaret for organizing the whole thing and inviting us to be here. So thank you so much for that. It's really great to be here. So storytelling, stories are what bring us together and help us to make our imaginations soar. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories tonight. The first one, in honor of this season, is Burdette. My husband and I drove down from the Adirondacks this afternoon. We watched the leaves as they're beginning to change. Everything is beginning to change a bit. And it reminded me of a story that Jay Yardley, my late husband, wrote many years ago, and I want to tell it to you. It was a clear, crisp, late October, bright blue sky Adirondack day. Elmer had been busy already. He'd been doing some of the chores in the last week or so. He had put in some of the firewood. He'd maybe gotten half of it in already. And he'd put some of the storm windows up on the house on the north side. He couldn't bear yet to start working in the garden because the sunflowers, they had those big heads, and the sunflower seeds were just ripening, and he just couldn't bear to take those down yet. Well, on this particular morning, Lena had started going on at him about all those chores that were just sort of half finished. And was he going to do anything about that? And that house was beginning to feel about as cabin fever close as a late February 20 below zero day. So that afternoon, when Lena started going on at him about cranberries and how could she make all the cranberry bread and the relish she wanted if she didn't have any cranberries, well, he was up out of his chair and out of the house like a shot. Into the shed he went and got his waders and a bucket, and he started down the dirt road. He went maybe halfway down the dirt road and looked off to the left, and there was the pond. Yep, that's where he was headed. He kept walking till he came to the 2 huge pine trees, and he knew that's where he should head off down the steep embankment. And he stopped at the bottom because there was a line almost where the dry land ended and the bog began that headed out to the pond. So he stopped there and he hiked up his waders, and then he very carefully put one foot out on the hummock. Now, the hummock was like a big mound of dirt that was in the bog, and Elmer knew if he stepped on that, he wouldn't sink down in the mud so much. It was hard to balance, but he knew how to do it. he slogged his way out carefully till he got close to the edge of the pond. Oh, when he got out there, that sun was beating down on his back. It felt good on this cool day. The sky so blue. The pond, a dead calm. He could hear chickadees and nuthatches off in the distance. And he could smell the balsam. Well, that's not what he was here for. He had to get to work. So he bent over and started looking for cranberries. Now, he was accustomed to doing this, but this was his first time this year. And it always took him a little while to get his cranberry eyes on. So he knelt down and he parted the moss and the green leaves and the twigs, and he looked, and there was a nice, bright red cranberry. He picked it and he put it into his bucket. Kerplink. That's courtesy of Robert McCloskey's Blueberries for Sal. And then he looked a little more, and there was another one. Kerplink. And another one. Kerplunk. And he kept going because now he was getting his cranberry eyes. And pretty soon he was in the real rhythm. And as he picked one and dropped it in the bucket, and then another and another, he could just feel the peace of that pond descending upon him. And he started breathing deeper and more easy. He had maybe a quarter of a bucket of cranberries when suddenly he heard the slam of a car door. He threw the trees back at the road where he'd come from, and up there on the road, there was a black, shiny car, and a man had gotten out. He had a white shirt on. As he came around the front, he kind of looked to Elmer like a city fella. And the man saw Elmer and he said, hello, and say, I'm lost. Can you help me? I'm looking for the old Douglas place. Yeah, said Elmer. You got to go back out to the road and then go down a couple more miles and then you'll be there. So the man thanked him and he didn't leave. Elmer kept picking cranberries. And then the man said, say, what's that you're doing down there? I'm picking cranberries, said Elmer. Oh, you're picking them by hand? Hey, I saw a documentary about that just recently, and they had this machine. Why, you could get that machine. You could pick in 1 hour what it probably takes you about 3 days to do by hand. You could bring one of those in here. You'd kind of have to widen the road a little bit, but I'm doing just fine the way I am, said Elmer. Well, the man still didn't go. He finally said, what's the name of that pond? This pond, it don't got a name, said Elmer. Oh, come on. In this modern day and age, everything has a name. Why, you're old timer, you just probably forgotten what it was. Well, that made Elmer finally stand up. He looked at the man. He looked at the pond. And he said, I just remembered. They call this here the bottomless pond. Bottomless pond? It doesn't look that deep. Why do they call it that? Well, said Elmer, it's just no one from around these parts has ever found the bottom of that pond. You don't say. And with that, the city guy, finally got in his car and went back the way he'd come. But Elmer's day of peace and quiet was done. So he got his quarter pail of cranberries, hiked up his waders, and slogged back to the house. It was a few days later when Lena was going on about how could she make all the cranberry bread and relish she wanted with only a quarter of a pail of cranberries. And Elmer was out of the house again, got his waders and his bucket, and he headed down the road, got to the big pine trees, went down the steep embankment, hiked up his waders, out to the edge of the pond. It wasn't sunny this day, but it was warmer. And he could just feel that peace already beginning to descend on him. He bent down. Oh, this time He started finding those cranberries right away, 3 at once, and then 4 over here, and 2, and 1, and 1. And he'd gotten 3/4 of a bucket of cranberries when he heard the slam of the car door. He just shook his head. He knew his day of peace and quiet was over, so he just started slogging back to the shore and up the hill, and there was that black, shiny car. But the guy, the city guy, he'd gotten out, but he wasn't paying any attention to Elmer. He'd gone around to the back of the car, opened up the trunk. He had his head buried in it. So Elmer went to the back of the car, and he looked in, and he said, "You mind my asking what you're doing?" The man, just surprised, he bonked his head on the trunk as he came out. There were all these coils of rope in there, and he said, "Well, you know, I heard what you said about this being the bottomless pond, and I decided I was going to go down to the hardware store and buy all the rope they had. I bought every bit of it that they had, and, well, old-timer, I am going to find out for you just how deep this bottomless pond of yours really is, and you won't ever have to worry about it again." Elmer didn't say anything. He just watched as the guy tied the rope together. He didn't even mention the kind of knots the guy was using. And then he tied the last rope to the car jack. And then he reached into the way back of the trunk and he pulled out a cardboard box. It had L.L. Bean written on the side of it. He said, "You know, I saw your waders and I thought I could use some of those, but I'd sure need something newer than yours so my feet would stay dry. So I got me a pair of those and I'm going to put them on." And he did. And then he picked up the ropes and the jack, and he started right down that steep embankment. Well, Elmer was not going to miss this. He was right behind him. And it's lucky he was, because when that guy got to the bottom, he just kept striding right out onto the bog, onto the first hummock, and he would have fallen over if Elmer hadn't caught him by the elbow. I'm fine, thanks. No, you just got to watch yourself. It's not as steady as it looks. So he slogged out to the edge of the pond, Elmer behind him. And when they got to the edge of the pond, Elmer could hear the feet of the city fella slogging and sloshing around inside those brand new L.L. Bean boots. Elmer's feet were as dry as a bone. Well, they got out there, and the man got all the coils of rope in one hand, and he got the car jack in the other hand. He said, "You're going to want to stand back now. I don't want you to get hurt." And he began to whirl the car jack around once, around twice, and he let it go. And it sailed into the air, and up and up and up it went with the tail of rope after it. And then it arced, and it began to come down and down with the rope, down, and then into the pond it went with a mighty splash. And it continued down 1 foot, 2 feet, and then, maybe 6 inches into the muddy bottom. The two men watched as, almost in slow motion, the rope cascaded down onto the surface of the pond. And then the man looked at Elmer. He said, "But you said no one had ever found the bottom of that pond." "Yeah, that's right. It's just, it wasn't ever something anyone from around here ever even cared to know about." The man looked at Elmer, and then he turned around, and he slogged back to the shore, up to the car, got in, turned around, and he was gone. Elmer just stood there for a minute, taking in the newfound peace and quiet of the pond. And then he reached down and he got hold of the rope and he began to pull it in. He pulled it in until he got the jack and he rinsed off the mud. All of that rope he coiled up, and he had the jack, and he had his 3/4 of a bucket of cranberries, and he hiked up his waders and back to the shore, up and back to his house. Now, he didn't go in the house right away. He went into the shed, And in the shed, he took the rope and the jack and hung them on a hook. And then he backed up a few feet and surveyed the wall. There were 7 hooks altogether. Every one of them had on it rope and a car jack. And then he went into the house and right into the kitchen, and Lena was there. She immediately, her eyes went to the bucket. Oh, 3/4 of a bucket. And then to his face. And she said, well, it looks like you found what you were looking for. Yeah, said Elmer. It was a good day on the pond. Oh, and we're going to be needing some more hooks out in the shed there. And that's that story. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to check my time here. Great. Okay, so this second story is one I've told for many years as well. It comes from when I used to run an arts and healing retreat for women with cancer and chronic illness. And I first heard of this story from a great storyteller by the name of Allison Cox. There was once a woman who had a lot of problems in her life, just so many, that there were times when she just couldn't even get her head off the pillow in the morning. It was that bad. She just didn't know what to do. Now, she had a friend who she knew also had a lot of problems in her life. But she noticed that her friend seemed to carry herself more lightly. Her face was lighter. Her whole being just seemed to move through life more easily. And this woman finally thought, maybe if I go and ask her what she does, and I do that, then I won't have so many problems, or I can carry them better. So she made some brownies, and she called the woman up and came over, and they sat down and they chatted for quite a while. And then the woman said, I just noticed that you're able to carry these problems that you have so much more easily. And I thought if you could tell me what you do and I did that, then maybe I'd be better. And her friend looked at her and she said, I'm so sorry, but I don't think I can help you because your problems are different from mine. They're what your problems are, and only you are going to know what to do about that. And this woman looked so crestfallen that her friend said, but there's one thing I could tell you. Oh, anything. Why don't you let that part of yourself that is connected to all that is take over your problems? And then maybe you'll find what you're looking for. The woman waited, but there was nothing more. So finally, she said thank you and goodbye and went home. And somehow she got through the rest of the day. And that night when she got into bed, she didn't lie down right away. She sat up in bed, and finally she said out loud, okay, I'm going to just ask that part of me that is connected to all that is, oh, please help me. I just don't know what else to do. There was no clap of thunder. There was no lightning bolt. So finally she lay down and she went to sleep. And when she was sleeping, she had a dream. In this dream, she was in a cave. It was a big cave. There was room above her head, and she could make out in the dim gray light the walls that were fairly far away. And she began to notice that on the floor of the cave were all these bundles of different sizes and shapes. And she was just puzzling over that when a motion caught her eye from one of the recesses of the cave, and it was someone walking towards her. And when that person got closer, she could see that it was a woman who had long flowing hair and a long flowing outfit. And that woman came right up to the dreamer, and the dreamer said, "Who are you, and where am I?" And this woman said, "You are in the cave of bundles of trouble, and I am the keeper of the cave." Bundles of trouble? Yes, said the keeper. Everyone carries on their left shoulder a bundle of troubles. The dreamer looked over and, oh my God, how had she never noticed this before? There was this enormous gray bundle on her left shoulder. And the second she noticed it, her whole left side began to sag with the heaviness of that bundle. And the keeper who was watching this said, "If you'd like, while you're here, you could put the bundle down." I could, yes. And so the dreamer went to lift the bundle. Oh my God, it was lucky she'd been going to the gym. And she lifted it up and let it fall with a big thud. And dust particles went up all over the place. Oh. And the keeper said, "As a matter of fact, you don't have to go home with that bundle." I don't? No. You do have to have a bundle, but not that one. Go around. You can try all these bundles on. See which one feels the best for you. So for the next while, the dreamer went from the first bundle she tried was the smallest one she could find, of course. And she put that on, but it just slid right off. It wouldn't even stay there. And then she tried all different ones of different sizes and shapes. And finally, she found one that just seemed right. And she came back to the keeper and she said, "I think I found the bundle that I'll be taking home." And the keeper said, "Wonderful. Would you like to look inside?" Okay. And so she parted the gray threads and parted them a little further. Oh, no. She had picked her very own bundle. And the keeper said, "Do not be dismayed, for that is often the way it happens. But don't worry, because there is more. You're not just connected to that bundle. Everyone carries on their other shoulder another bundle." And the dreamer looked over and, whoa, why, there was another bundle right there. How had she never noticed that? But it was a very different bundle. The keeper said, "This is the bundle of aspirations, hopes, accomplishments, dreams." And she said, "If you'd like, you could look inside it." And the dreamer looked. Now, this bundle was not gray. It was woven with threads of silver and gold, and it had emanating from it a light that seemed to be coming from the rainbow. And she went to lift it, and it practically floated off of her shoulder. And she brought it down, and she parted the gold and the silver threads. And she looked inside. Oh, my God. How had Mount Marcy gotten inside that bundle? She had climbed that mountain last year, all 5,344 feet of it. And there was the time when she had helped her girls take the training wheels off their bicycle and learn how to ride a two-wheeler. Oh, and there was the drawing class she'd always wanted to take and had never gotten around to. There was the book that she had published 2 years ago, and she just kept looking at all these things. And finally, she lifted her face to thank the keeper of the cave. But the keeper was gone. The cave was gone. The woman was sitting up in her own bed, in her own bedroom, with the morning sun shining in full on her face, which was filled with joy. Oh, she knew there were troubles. There would always be one trouble or another. But she now knew that she had something else that she was connected to, that other bundle. She had found what she was looking for. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yay, perfect. Thank you so much. This is really, really fun. So it is my utter delight to be able to introduce you to our next storyteller. This is someone I have known for many, many years in the storytelling world, and I'm going to read a few things that she wanted me to share with you. She used to teach middle school in Niskayuna for many years, where she shared the art of storytelling, and then she went out freelancing and teaching storytelling in 1991. And she works regularly with the Interfaith Youth Storytellers Children at the Well, and offers workshops and performances for Northeast storytelling. It is always a joy and a pleasure and an honor to hear her. Please welcome Marni Gillard.
Well, we're the tall and the short of it, aren't we, Fran Yardley? When I walked in the door tonight, I saw a sign that said it's Peace Week in Saratoga Springs. And I thought, oh, good, because this story brings me peace. And I know the world needs peace. A lot of peace right now. And if we all do our part, a part of me thinks we can get there. We can get there. This is a story about the life of Sister Thea Bowman. Now, she wasn't Thea Bowman at the beginning of her life, and I'm going to tell you about that. But she chose that name when she became a sister. And the word Thea to her meant of God. And it was also like her father's name, Theon Bowman. So this is a little bit about what I think of from the biography of Thea Bowman, which is called Thea's Song. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. 1937, Theon Bowman and Mary Esther, his wife, had been waiting for a child for 13 years. They lived in Canton, Mississippi, and Theon was the black doctor. The town was happy to have him because it was Jim Crow time. It was segregation. And the blacks and the whites, they didn't mingle. So to have this young man come into town, start a doctor's office, and a beautiful young teacher as his wife who'd work in those separate but not so equal schools. And they were married. Theon was a Methodist man. His people had been Methodist for generations. Mary Esther was from High Episcopal Church, but they were both faith-filled people, and they just kept believing and kept asking, bring us a child. So it's a late December day in Canton, Mississippi. It's warm. A December day. Did I say that? It's warm. It's almost muggy. And Mary Esther, she's gone to live in a city about 45 minutes away, Yazoo City, so she can live with a friend of hers during the last time of her pregnancy. Maybe it'd be due early January. She wasn't sure, but she was feeling really great that morning and said, I think I'm going to go for a walk and go down to the shops and see if I can get myself a couple more baby things. Don't know if it's a boy or a girl, but baby things. And their plan was that Theon would get the call if her contractions started, and he would come quick, close the office and come over from Canton and to Yazoo City. And in Yazoo City, there was an old African hospital. No hospital for blacks in Canton. But Theon had delivered a lot of babies in people's bedrooms, and he wasn't worried one way or another. But she was happy there, staying with her friend, a nurse friend, those last couple of weeks. But when she hit that shopping store, her eyes saw things, but then her insides saw something else. And she said, I better get home. This baby's wanting to be out in the world. And sure she did, back to her friend's house, and her friend called Theon, and she even called the doctor that was a friend who was at the hospital, and he said, oh, no, don't worry, first early contractions, it's a wait yet. Don't be worried about rushing off to the hospital yet. Well, by the time Theon got there, this little baby not only wanted to be in the world, she was ready to fly into the world. And they named her Bertha, but they called her Birdie from that day on as a young child. And they were happy. Oh, they were happy, those Bowmans. They brought that child to the grandmother's house in her church. And of course, they went to the mother's church to get christened. And they went to the father's church. And they had all kinds of relatives welcoming this longed-for child. And she was ready to be in the world like a born bird. She was a happy girl, and her parents' education was everything to them. So they started right in, those 3 billy goats gruff, and Mama making trip, trap, trip, trap, trip, trap, and Daddy making, get off my bridge. Get off my bridge, or I'll come to eat you up. And she would laugh and laugh at the funny acting out that they did. And they sang to her, and they took her to the circus before she was even a year old, and she just kicked her feet, trying to be like the elephants, and learned how to clap her hands with her mama's hands. And this great spirit was growing inside this little girl in the South in the 1930s. Well, time went on. She was learning to read because her parents both read lots to her, and her mother was a school teacher, so she took her right off to the kindergarten class, and little 3-year-old Birdie Bowman was just right in there with all the kindergartners and learning and learning and learning and loving life. And all those church-going places that they'd been, those places were fanning some kind of light inside that girl, a flame that was growing. And she'd look around and say to her mama, I like the way they say, amen. Amen. How come nobody ever says, hey, women, Mama? And her mother's laughed and said, I don't know, we'll have to talk to the preacher. I'm going to be a preacher, she says. I want to be a preacher too. I want to be a preacher. And she loved watching the old ones. She always loved telling the story of how she was born to old ones. And oh yes, she had saved her daddy $25 because she didn't go to that old African hospital. And he came and just delivered her right in the bed. Oh, my parents, they loved me. She knew they loved her. She felt this energy of love just filling her spirit in Jim Crow times. She just held all that dark hatred at bay. And one day, a new group came into town. Apparently, there weren't a lot of Catholics in Mississippi, maybe still aren't, but there was a bishop, and he realized that city of Canton had so many sharecroppers, probably 80% of the people in the town. And they weren't getting educated, and they weren't sending their kids to school because they could come and help in the fields and make more money. And so he reached out from some of his resources and found some folks that called themselves missionaries, some lay and some were professed nuns or priests. And they came over to the city of Canton, and they opened a store that would be low cost. They opened a small clothing place, or used clothing and furniture and all kinds of things like that. They had a good outreach, these missioners. They'd been lots of places in different parts of the world, but here they were right from Alabama to Mississippi. They knew what they were doing. And little by little, they reached out to the community of blacks. And the community came. And these were whites, but they weren't like the whites in town, scowling at you or shaming you or saying, no, you can't sit there. No, don't you go there. None of that. It was a different feeling. And little Bertie Bowman started taking it in. What kind of church is this, she thought. And the nuns and the lay people were there, and they chatted with her, and her mother came over, and they all introduced each other. They were right near Dr. Bowman's office. And the little girl said, Mama, I want to be a Catholic. I want to be a Catholic. And the parents are, oh boy, that's what we get for traveling around all those different places of worship. Well, we'll see, they said. And she loved going in and helping in the store. She loved talking to the different adults, and they were treating her with a lot of respect and as if she were a big girl. And by the time she was 9, she came home one more time and said, I'm going to be a Catholic. I want to do this. I want to be like that. I want to be of service. I want to sit sometimes when it's quiet in prayer. I like singing. I like the way we sway down the aisle and clap our hands and say amen, but I like something about that silence too, Mama. And her mother took a breath, and the next thing they knew, they were getting her baptized again with the Catholics. But it wasn't a big deal. It was like she had just made new friends. She and her friend Flanzy, who was just a little bit younger, they used to tie scarves around their heads and walk around like they were nuns. And sometimes they had rosary beads that the nuns gave them, and they put them on their belts. And it just was a transformation for this little girl. And it was making her happy. Her light was shining. She loved all her songs. She sang at all the different churches, and she kept going to the different churches. But she liked something. She couldn't quite say it all, but she liked something about this new group of people. And that bishop, that one bishop that was in Mississippi, he put out words, let's see if we can get some teaching nuns. We could start a school. We could start a Catholic school. Well, okay, and one of the priests said, I got a bunch of different people that I know over the course of the country. I'll put out the word and see what we can find. And pretty soon, 5 nuns came down from La Crosse, Wisconsin. And all the sharecroppers' kids were coming to school. Some had never been to school before. And they put up a sign, welcome to anyone at all. If you hadn't been schooled, not a problem. We'll get you started. If you had a different kind of religion that you wanted to practice, wonderful, wonderful. Just come to our school. We're happy to have you. And this something started growing in Thea. And by the time she was 15 years old, again, she came home and stood firm in her kitchen and said, Sister says, I can go for the summer and see what it's like to be a nun. I think I want to be a nun, Mom. I want to be a nun. I want to be a sister. Oh, Bertie, 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 you're our one and only. We can't have you being off and being a nun and no husband or all that, especially up north. They don't have black people up north, you know. They don't? She said. Her father said they do. They do. But just like in town, they're not always treated so well, and they're not spoken to well. These nuns and this priest and this bishop that's helping them out, they're acting different from white people. It's not going to be different like that up there. Daddy, I'm going to make them love me. They're not going to be mean to me. They're not. And she was a little right and a little wrong. And off she went that summer. She was 17 years old, going to school now there. They had a whole educational program along with becoming a beginning nun and a second part nun and final vows and all of that. And she was learning and thrilled at all there was to learn. But that silence that she'd liked for a while, there was too much of it. All walking so slow in a row and putting our heads down and saying our silent prayers and nobody saying amen. Nobody singing real loud or sashaying down the aisle. It was a place where some part of her was lost. And then there were things that were said or people asking about her hair and how'd you get hair like that? Nobody has hair like that. Stuff like that. And it was just hurting her heart. And I don't know if it was that or if it was the striving of trying to be good and be the best and do just what the sisters wanted, like she'd always wanted to be somebody who stood out, somebody who was learning the best or the most, that light of hers that wanted to shine. I don't know what it exactly was, but suddenly these spots are found on her lungs, and they're calling it tuberculosis. And for 2 whole years, one in a hospital in La Crosse and one in a sanatorium a little farther away, but still up north, she got herself better. With prayer, with keeping her spirits high, with doing all the studying she could do and learning lots. One certain nun kind of took Thea. Well, she wasn't Thea yet, still Bertha. She took her under her wing and said, I've got some authors I want you to learn about. There's this wonderful Langston Hughes and his poetry and stories, and Richard Wright. And James Baldwin's coming along. He's got a voice you'll want to read. And the little girl's mind began to expand of, okay, there's some of my old culture up here, and I can be here, and I can be this light that will shine. And sure enough, in time, she made her final vows. All her friends were way past her and off in different jobs, but she took her first teaching job in La Crosse, in the Catholic school there, the Sacred Heart School. And there was a day, not long after she'd started teaching, that she got wind that some of the parents were not happy with the black nun. And the principal and she talked about it, and she remembered her daddy saying, "Well, they're not going to like you." And she thought, oh, Daddy, I'm going to make them like me. And she brought all her students' parents in and had the best back-to-school night she'd ever imagined having, singing with them, showing them all the work the children were doing and how she knew them. And each one of them had a special place in her heart, a special spot on the wall, and she was going to make this the classroom of their life. And before you know it, other kids were saying, can't we be in the black nuns class? Can't we be in the black nuns class? And she turned that situation around. It was there. It was something she knew would be there in the world. But she just kept on going. And the next year they said, you want to go back to Canton? Canton? Back to my old school? I could be a teacher in my old school. You bet I do. And she was down there in the 60s. And she was helping with Dr. King coming to town and getting voter rights going and helping people find homes in different places that they could stay while these freedom riders were coming to town. The world was on fire and changing that world she'd lived in, or attempting to, and she began to be a part of it. Her high school students, she taught to sing spirituals, all the great spirituals. And who was this nun, they thought? We're supposed to be learning English and math. Oh, we're going to be learning English and math, don't you worry. But we're going to make an album, and we're going to sell it and raise some money for the school. And next thing you knew, she was taking them on a big bus to churches, all kinds of churches and schools around the country, any place they'd let her in. And they were having these wonderful field trips and coming back and studying hard and getting an education. And everything was starting to change. She saw a calling not to be just of service, not to be just a silent prayer, but somebody connecting the cultures, sharing her culture and eliciting theirs. She greatly believed that every child has a gift, every adult has a gift, has a calling, as she did. And sometimes all you had to do was say, do you know your calling? And people would be kind of shy, but say, I do. My calling is to be a dad, or my calling is to be a teacher, or a businessman, or start my own idea, or an artist. So many people she met as she began to travel. And because she had gotten her BA up at the college connected to the convent, she wanted to start working on a master's. And sure enough, that $25 her dad had started that education bank account with helped out, and the nuns and the bishop himself said, we've got a place for this woman. I'm sending her right to Catholic University down in Washington, D.C. There she'll see a different look at culture than she has in her town in Mississippi. And sure enough, her eyes were wide at all the African Americans, people truly from Africa and the Caribbean, and all different ethnic groups of many different kinds. And she felt at home there. Studied and studied and studied, and she had a chance to meet other black nuns. Lots of black nuns there, and lots of young black priests that were coming either from Africa or from towns, and they were organizing, and she said, well, we women, we're going to organize. We're going to get a sisters congregation going that's all for our culture and all the ways we want to celebrate in this Catholic world. Well, she got a chance to go to Europe. Now, what did she want to go to when she went to Europe? Oxford. A summer only. But at Oxford, she wanted to study about Sir Thomas More, who in the Catholic Church was a martyr and called Saint Thomas More. He'd stood up to Henry VIII at the beginning of that part of the Reformation and said, you can't claim to be the leader of the church just because the leader over in Rome doesn't want you to divorce. And divorce wasn't the only thing Henry was up to, as many of us might know. He was taking off heads and all kinds of bad stuff. And she wanted that story. It was something that jarred her because her roots from her mother's side were Anglican roots, Episcopal roots. And she wanted to see, how did we get a beautiful, warm, loving church again after that? And her PhD was the story of that back at Catholic U in Washington. So she was making a name for herself and building her intellectual world. And she said, I want to be of service more. And the bishop said, you come work for me. Yes, you're part of your order and they'll be having things they want you to do, but you come work for me. The idea of intercultural connection, it's just beginning, and we've got to work on it. We all know it's no melting pot that we live in. More salad, as some people would say. But even there, it's got to be something we know from each other. And doesn't she go off not only sometimes with her old high school kids, but she gets a great, wonderful Hallelujah adult chorus that travels the country in a great big bus. She was one of the first nuns on the bus. And Dan Rather gets a hold of her, puts her on 60 Minutes, and gets a whole story about her there. And she's happy. But even as she's happy, her body turns against her again, and cancer starts. And everywhere she goes, she said, I'm alive. I am alive, and I'm living my calling, and no cancer is going to take me down till God's ready for me and opens the arms of the world and lets me in. I'm not saying no because of this cancer. She did go back to Canton for a while because her parents were aging, and they were really getting weaker and weaker, and she knew their lives were coming to an end, but hers wasn't. And by the time it was 1988, she was 50 years old. Her parents were gone. But she talked to that bishop, and he said, I got a big job for you. Every bishop in the Catholic Church gathers for a big enclave every year. And we look at what's going right, what's going wrong, how can we talk, how can we change. Vatican II, back in the 60s, had brought lots of ideas for change, but there was a lot of conflict of, no, we don't want that, or we don't want that. And she found herself the keynote speaker at that. And YouTube is changing these days, but if you go on YouTube and you can get it working for you, there's lots of examples of videos of her at that conference, one that's almost an hour long. And she sits in a wheelchair because the cancer is definitely with her. But surrounding her are the Black, African, but sometimes American, all different places that they've come from, people that are wanting to change and make it so you can have within this Catholic framework an apostolate that's for Black worship, and the kind where you clap your hands and sashay down the aisle. And I remember the first time I went to a Black Catholic Mass, the priest put that big book on the top of his head, and he danced all around, and it didn't fall off. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. He was from Ghana, and he lives in Albany. And yeah, the Black Catholic apostolates, the Hispanic apostolates, there's a Vietnamese apostolate now in the Diocese of Albany, New York. A big change happened. And Thea, with her great singing and her love of it, got together with others and worked on developing her own hymnal called Lead Me, Guide Me Along the Way. That is a book of spirituals and a lot of songs that come from the Black community and all the Protestant communities. And she was very proud to have that kind of become the hymn book. And you can see it in that Albany church. Actually, it's in Manans. But it's great. Father Kofi from Ghana is still there for 30-something years. She changed our church. It's not changed enough. We all know that from all kinds of things happening with Catholic Church. But it's the church I grew up in as a little girl and was inducted into through nuns that were young and pretty and taught me to believe in myself and told me all kinds of stories I still love to tell today. So when I think of Thea, I think of her sitting down in her wheelchair but saying, "Gentlemen, up out of your seats. Come on, we've talked long enough." She sang to him, "I feel like a motherless child." She sang to him a lot. But she said, "Your turn now. Come on, put your arms around each other. Don't be afraid. Oh, I know you boys. You all get all afraid of touching each other. Come on. Get together. I think you know the song. And if you can sing it with me wherever you are out there in listening land or right in front of me. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. Thank you, Sister Thea. Thank you, all my teachers. Thank you all who are voting and helping others vote and changing the world. Every one of us has to be part of it. And thanks, Saratoga, for having a Peace Week. Amen. To introduce our final speaker. I'm so glad I remembered. Eliud Nieves was born in Puerto Rico, but he wandered his way up into New York City with the help of some adults, I'm sure, and now finds himself in Ithaca, New York, a place with many storytellers. But he comes back to the Capital District regularly to be part of our story circle at Proctor's Theater. We're often doing things through that, so keep your eyes open for that. Eliud Nieves, thank you for coming all this way, all these times. Have a good storytelling.
Okay, I get a mic too. Great. Well, thank you, Marni, for that wonderful story. And Fran, thank you. And I'm glad to be here. My stories are a little different than what we've heard today. My first story is called The Black Prince, and it's from ancient Egypt. See, a long time ago in Egypt, there was a boy who he considered himself ugly, not very handsome. When he was a little boy, he had an accident. He had a scar on his face, and he would walk around kind of looking down so people wouldn't look at him. Frankly, he was kind of lazy. He was unmotivated, didn't want to do much. All he cared about was a wooden flute that he had carved himself. And he would walk around the village, the city, playing his flute. And wherever he stopped, he would just take a nap, go to sleep. His own mother would say, that boy will come to nothing. She would often add, one day, I suspect he's going to fall asleep at the edge of the river and drown. Well, one day, the boy was walking around the city, playing his flute, taking a nap here, there, when he came upon a brick wall that was painted white. He had never noticed this wall before. He saw beautiful trees growing behind that wall, so he climbed because he was curious to see what was on the other side. And what he saw was the most exquisite garden that he had ever seen. It had trees of all kinds. There were fruit trees, flowering trees. There were exotic birds that would dart in and out of the trees. The beautiful flowers that grew had butterflies dancing all over them. And then there were meandering trails made of cobblestones. But what truly caught his eye was a young woman, serene, sitting by a pool of water. He felt so much longing that he wanted to play the flute, but the wind seemed to be blowing in a different direction. So he took the flute to his lips and softly began to play. When she didn't turn around, he realized that she didn't notice him. So he played everything that he felt. He played all afternoon. And just before the sun went down, the young woman got up. She walked away and disappeared among the trees. That night, the boy couldn't sleep. He couldn't stop thinking about the girl in the garden. And the next day, he went back to the wall and he climbed. And again, he waited for her. And in the afternoon, she arrived and sat by the pool of water. And again, he played everything that he felt. The next day he came back. You see, he was falling in love. And you know how it is when you fall in love for the first time, how your heart pounds excitedly for the one that you long for? You can't wait to see her or him. Well, that's how he felt. He felt as though his feet didn't touch the ground. He was in love. He fantasized that one day he would jump into the garden and she would love him as much as he loved her. And he would play music just for her alone. And he would ask her to marry him. And they would go out of the garden and live with his mother at the edge of the river in her little hut. Well, one day he was going home in the evening, and he stopped at the well in the center of the village to listen to the old women gossip. And they were talking about a garden. And the more he heard, the more he realized that they were talking about the garden that he went to every day. And then, as he listened more, he realized that the girl he had fallen in love with was none other than the Pharaoh's daughter, the Princess Thutmose. Now, he knew that a princess would never love a boy who was poor, not very good looking, lazy. He didn't know what to do. He walked around the city all night, brokenhearted. He couldn't go home. Just before sunrise, he walked out of the city gate and into the market, where he found a caravan of merchants. And the men bade him to come and sit and have some tea, and he did. And they began to tell the kinds of tales that merchants tell. Tales about mysterious faraway places and magic and magicians. And he listened intently as they talked about a magician named Habi. He can do anything, one of them said. The boy said, can he change a man's soul? God willing, if he is alive, he can change a man's soul. He can perform miracles. Where can I find this Habi? They told him that he had to walk for 3 days and 3 nights into the desert without stopping. So, with just the clothes on his back and the flute that he had carved, he walked into the desert and didn't stop for 3 days and 3 nights. Then he came to an oasis where he found a tree with a donkey tied to it and an old hut. The door flung open and an old man came out, bald, wide-eyed, and toothless. Are you Habi, the magician? That is my name. Well, I've heard that. Boy, everybody hears about me. No. Refresh yourself, wash up, and have some tea, and after that, you can tell me your story and tell me what you want." Well, the boy washed up. He had some tea, but he couldn't rest. He sat waiting for the magician to sit next to him. Eventually he did. And he told him his story, how he had fallen in love with the princess and how she could never love him. Then he said, Can you make me strong? Can you make me ruthless? Can you make me charismatic? Can you make me powerful? A warrior, a prince? That I can do. But once I change a man's soul, I can never change it back. Do it. Do it. Well, what are you going to pay me? All he had was his flute, so he gave the magician his flute. Days passed in the city, in the village. His mother searched for him when she couldn't find him. And she said, alas, he must have fallen asleep by the river and drowned. They had a funeral. She grieved, and she said, alas, so be it. Well, 3 years passed, and the enemies of Egypt had attacked. The Pharaoh had lost most of his land and half of his wealth. The soldiers were camped in the middle of the desert, about to surrender, when a young man was seen walking across the sand on foot, dressed all in black. He approached the soldiers and asked to see the Pharaoh. His appearance was startling. He was so handsome, so charismatic that they took him straight to the Pharaoh. Now, the Lord of Egypt was impressed himself. The young man said that he was known as the Black Prince, and if the Pharaoh would let him lead his armies, he would win back all of Egypt and lands beyond. The Pharaoh agreed, and the prince's strategy worked. In a few weeks, he had gotten back all of Egypt, lands beyond, and he had captured more than 10,000 prisoners. Pharaoh thanked him, and he told him that if he went to the palace 1 month from that day, he would reward him. He could have anything that he wanted, wealth, power. He could lead the armies. He could share the throne with the Pharaoh. The Black Prince bowed and said that he would go to the palace in a month. Well, word of the Black Prince spread quickly. The women swept the streets clean, and they scattered white flowers on the pathways. On the day that he arrived, the women watched from trellis windows. The men stood on rooftops. Every heart stopped beating. The Black Prince entered the palace, and there he saw the Pharaoh sitting on a gold throne. Next to him, on another throne, was the Princess Thutmose. Again, the Pharaoh thanked the Black Prince, and he promised anything that he wanted, wealth, power. Help them rule Egypt. But the young man did not take his eyes off of the princess, and he said, "No, I want neither wealth nor power. All I ask is for the hand of the princess in marriage." The princess stood up. She said, "Father, if it is your command, I will marry him. But please, listen to my story. You see, I was so alone. I had no one with whom to share my feelings with. And then one day, a boy appeared on the white wall, and he played the flute. I know that he played for the sky and for the water and for the beautiful flowers, but everything that he played were my feelings. And I imagined that one day he would jump from that wall and that he would love me as much as I loved him. And we would spend our time together. And I would ask him to marry me, and we would come and live here in the palace. But then one day, he didn't come. I sent my servants and my handmaidens to the village, to the city. Everyone had heard of the boy who played the flute. But then, Father, I heard that he had drowned. And Father, I know that I can never love as deeply again. And I vowed that I would marry no one but him. The Black Prince listened intently, and he looked at the princess for a long time, and he said, I once had a love as deep as yours. I would never make you marry me. And with that, he turned around and he walked out of the palace. And the Black Princess said that he walked into the desert on foot and was never seen or heard of again. The Black Prince. My next story, and my last story, is called Masiatunya, and it comes from Africa. See, the Zambezi River flows from Zimbabwe to Zambia. And at one point, this mighty river drops thousands of feet, creating a waterfall much higher than Niagara. The first white man to see this waterfall was David Livingstone, the British explorer, and he named it after Queen Victoria. But for thousands of years, the people that lived along the river called it Masiatunya, the smoke that thunders. For there's always a vast mist at the very top of the falls, and one can hear its mighty roar for miles upon miles. Now, war was common among the African tribes that lived along the river, and courage was held sacred. One must never run from battle, and if one ever did, his fate will be to be thrown into Masiatunya, into the boiling, churning waters below, never to be seen again. Now, one day, many years ago, Chief Zawezi stood with his tribesmen to put to death one who had run from battle. The powerful Zawezi stood on a rock, gazing down upon the thousands who had gathered there. "Bring Konkela forward," he thundered. "He is my sister's child, and more dear to me than my own would have been. But if he has run like a coward, he must die and have other cowards before him." Konkela sat with his hands tied behind his back. Another soldier untied him and whispered, "Courage, Konkela, courage." "I am not afraid to die," said Konkela, his head held high. "Tell me again, Konkela, what happened in battle?" said the chief. "Uncle, I have told you again and again, there is nothing more to tell. But perhaps I missed something. Please tell me again, because I have no joy in seeing you die. You would have been chief in my stead." "Uncle," Konkela began, "I was honored to lead your troops into battle against your enemy, Zagari. We planned the battle well. Half of the men stayed in the bush. The other half, I was leading them to scale the walls of the village. And we would burn the houses. But we did. But his spies outwitted us. They had gone from their homes. They knew we were coming. So there we were, burning houses behind us and the enemy in front of us. Many of us climbed the walls to escape the flames, but we were perfect targets for their spears. Those of us who were still alive regrouped, and we continued to fight. By the gods of our fathers, we fought, Uncle. I saw my mother's own sons fall dead beside me in battle. Uncle, I am sick of war, and I am ready to die. But I tell you with pleasure that your enemy, Zagari, is dead. With my own spear, I pierced him. But then my strong arm fell weary no more. I looked at it, and I saw blood running down my arm, down my hand, drenched the ground. An enemy had almost severed my arm from my body. Uncle, I could do no more. Zawezi asked him in agony, and so you ran? You should have stayed and died like a hero and not run like a coward. Suddenly a sound was heard. A woman wailing for the dead. Oh, Zawezi! Oh, Zawezi! The soldiers parted, and there stood a woman, beautiful and small. It was Conquela's wife, and in her hand she held a tightly covered basket. She ran and she knelt in front of Zawezi. Have mercy, uncle. Have mercy. 11 months I have been Conquela's wife. And now, like all mothers before me, I carry our child under my heart. Would you leave me without a husband? Would you leave my unborn child without a father? Mercy, uncle! Mercy, uncle! Her tears ran down her cheeks. Zawezi hid his face with his hand because his eyes were wet too. But he said, Woman, do not ask me to do this, for I am just a man. I have said that all who run from battle must die. But I tell you what I can do. When your child is born, be he man child or woman child, he will be the head of our family. Then she said, well, maybe you will accept the gift that I have for you. It might help you change your mind. And before anyone could say a word, she leaped on the rock next to him and opened the basket, and she thrust it on his head. And then she ran towards the waterfall, calling, Conquela! Conquela, better that I should die than you. And when she got to the waterfall, she bent her knees and she leaped into Macetunya, the smoke that thunders, never to be seen again. Now, Zawezi removed the basket from his head, and the people recoiled in horror when they saw the present that Conquela's wife had brought to the chief. It was a snake, cold and deadly, and it had wrapped itself around his head like a turban. And he felt it bite him again and again. But Zawezi was strong. He took the snake by the tail and pulled it from his head, and then still holding his tail, he smashed it against the rock and he killed it. But then he sat down. See, the snake's poison was also strong, and he knew he had only moments left to live. And Zawezi said, all my life I have lived with violence and war. It took the courage of this brave woman to show me that there is courage that goes beyond the hunting ground, beyond the battlefield. My loyal soldiers promise me that when I die, Conquela will be your next chief. And amid the burning of torches, thousands of voices rang out, Long live Conquela! Long live Conquela! Though this happened many, many years ago, you can still go to Mother Africa and see Mosiatunya, the smoke that thunders. Thank you.